Karsch, Scott Anderson, 97.1. All right, so the NFL Draft Combine gets underway today, and we'll hear shortly from Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. The Burchie kid is en route and will be there when they speak today. Burchie, how are you?
I'm doing great, fellas. About an hour outside Indy, cruising down in our station Chevy Tahoe that is wrapped in 9870 alt branding. So this is a dual threat trip. I am both doing some information gathering and some brand promotion down in Indianapolis for anyone interested in some alternative rock music.
There you go. Nice.
But yeah, psyched to get there. We'll hear from Brad Holmes at 1 o'clock today, Dan Campbell at 2, and then Drew Petzing for the first time later this afternoon, and Kelvin Shepard after Petzing. So a lot on the docket today in Indy.
Are you there all week?
I am there through Thursday.
Okay. Are you disappointed that you're not going to get a chance to really see the nuts and bolts of what the combine looks like with the players out there on the field?
I think I'll get 1 day of on-field workouts. Those begin Thursday, I believe. So I'll take all that in, and I might try and run the 40 myself, see if I can clock like a sub-5. That'd be big time.
It would be, and I odds are against it. Yeah, I do too. Okay, so the big question today, maybe the number one question for Holmes, for Campbell, is there a timeline or any indication of what Taylor Decker is going to do?
Yeah, I was going to say that has to be the most pressing item on the Brad Holmes press conference agenda. And, they clearly need to press Decker for an answer if they don't have one yet. They're not going to let themselves fall into the same trap they fell into last year with Frank Ragnow. They're going to demand an answer from Taylor one way or another before free agency and obviously before the draft so that they know what they might need to do at left tackle. It sounds like to me they've already begun to have some of those conversations with Taylor, so I think he's well aware of the deadline that he's probably under. And then the other important housekeeping item for Brad Holmes to address today is what David Montgomery's future looks like or doesn't look like with the Lions. It was Brad Holmes himself who cast pretty serious doubt on Montgomery's future with Detroit at his end-of-season press conference when he floated the possibility of needing to move him to a location that would be able to better utilize his strengths. And so, either they've had conversations with David that have smoothed out his concerns about his role here, or they feel like, he'd be better suited elsewhere. So I think those two things from a housekeeping perspective are pretty important for Brad Holmes to address today.
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting. If he gets moved before things really get cooking this week, then obviously every Lions fan is going to be watching the combine to see what running backs do, and it looks like it's a pretty deep draft for running backs.
Yeah, it does. And I'm firmly of the belief that they would prefer to keep David Montgomery. They just signed him to an extension, last year, I guess 2 years ago, but really last season, midway through 2024, and that wasn't with the intentions of needing to move him. I think that the hire of Drew Petzing is one thing that works toward David Montgomery returning. It sounds like David and Drew have had conversations, and Drew has expressed to David how much they would like to involve him in the offense moving forward. And that was a run-first offense in Arizona. And I think if they can get David back to, just 1A duty behind Gibbs as number one, that'll be enough for him to stick around. But his workload last year really sunk to like B level, and that's not sensible cap management for the Lions, and it doesn't make sense for David to stick around if that's the case.
Another big offseason story that Brad Holmes might get into today that intrigues me quite a bit is offseason restructuring of contracts. Is there any indication on a timeline of that, or is this something that just is another agenda item that gets discussed today?
Yeah, I don't think that he will address anyone's contract specifically, just because that's the way that he's operated in the past. But I think it's a foregone conclusion that Jared Goff's contract is going to get restructured at some point in the next month or so. I think they're not entering next season with Jared Goff's cap hit as it looks now, and then there's a possibility they could look into restructures for guys like Sewell and St. Brown to create more cap room in 2026 and 2027. If, a player like Max Crosby might be someone that piques your interest, that would kick a lot of money down the road, and it would probably create a championship window that right now doesn't necessarily exist. Like, you would kind of box yourself into probably needing to win in the next 3 years if you restructure more than just Jared's contract. So I don't know that they'll do that, but it's probably worth at least considering.
Something else when it comes to contracts is they got a couple of fourth-year guys that are, looking at extensions too with Sam Laporta and Brian Branch. And, with the combine, I got to believe that tight end is an area that they're going to consider drafting a player. In fact, I would expect them to draft a tight end. But what do you feel about an extension? What are you hearing about an extension for either of those players?
So first of all, those two names loom large over this offseason for the Lions, Brian Branch and Sam Laporta. Those two positions not long ago felt like long-term positions of strength, and they still might be for Detroit. But at the same time, those two guys are entering contract seasons coming off pretty serious injuries, a torn Achilles for Branch and a back injury for Laporta that required surgery. And in the tight end room, you've got Brock Wright, who's also entering a contract season, and I'm not so confident that he's here beyond 2026, and the Lions will want to see what Laporta looks like coming off a back injury, I would imagine, before committing to an extension for him. And in the safety room, you've got the Brian Branch injury we've documented, and then Kirby Joseph, who is looking at what the Lions have called a chronic injury that could very well alter his career beyond 2026. That's a player whose contract extension hasn't even kicked in yet, and honestly is no guarantee at this point to be on the roster in 2027. The Lions could get out of that contract after this year at a pretty minimal dead cap cost moving forward. So all of a sudden, this offseason, and especially in this draft, safety and tight end feel like possible positions of need, maybe even pressing need. And it is a great draft, Gator, I agree, to be looking for a tight end on, say, day 2 or day 3. It feels like one of the deepest tight end drafts in recent memory. I heard today that there were like 27 tight ends invited to the combine, and usually it's closer to 16 or 17. The one guy that has caught my eye so far is Texas A&M tight end, which obviously relates to Dan Campbell, Nate Borkacher, who was, I think, 4 years at Nebraska and wasn't much of a pass catcher, went to A&M last year, proved to be just a road grader of a blocker. And, it seems like there's maybe more pass catching upside there. He's a day 3 name guy to watch. And then at safety, I think that Bud Clark from TCU is a ball hawker that could potentially replace Kirby Joseph in this defense if that's the route the Lions go. So those two names kind of are on my radar this week in Indy.
Brad Holmes, Dan Campbell, set to speak this afternoon from the NFL Draft Combine. Burchie will be there covering it for us. Another big question is, what's the plan at center?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest question entering next season. I actually just wrote about this yesterday because we talked with Daniel Jeremiah last week, who's probably the most plugged in national NFL draft analyst out there. And he was asked about the possibility of finding centers in this draft who can start on day 1 next season. And frankly, there aren't a lot of them. And the best of the center bunch, Connor Lew from Auburn, is coming off a torn ACL, which, puts his availability for, September of next season anyways into question. But Jeremiah did highlight 3 guys that he thinks have a chance to be day 1 starters at center next year: Sam Heck from Kansas State, Jake Slaughter from Florida, and then Trey Zune from A&M, who's another really interesting name because he was a 4-year starter at tackle for Texas A&M and was one of the best pass blocking tackles in the country over his career there, but probably projects as more of a guard or a center in the NFL. And that was one of the guys that Jeremiah thinks has a chance to start at center as soon as next season. I think what makes the most sense for the Lions at center, and this might pain some fans to hear, isn't Tyler Linderbaum. First of all, I'm not even sure the Ravens let him depart. And if they do, I don't think the Lions are in a position to squeeze in another top-of-the-market contract under their salary cap. I think what makes more sense is targeting someone like Connor McGovern of the Bills or, say, Cade Mays of the Panthers if you're in the free agent market. And then looking into trades. I'm going to ask Drew Petzing today, for example, about how much he liked Yelda Froholt, who was the center in Arizona for the past 3 seasons, a really stable, proven player there. And I think as someone who's entering a contract season could be a trade target for the Lions this offseason. Aaron Brewer of the Dolphins, another name to watch. If they could get a guy like that to come in and give them stable play for a season, they could draft a player like, say, Hecht or Slaughter or Lew, let them develop for a year, and then plug them in as starter in 2027.
I do want to bring something up here because on this radio program last year, our producer Kang nailed 2 draft picks out of left field that people didn't expect in Tyleik Williams and Isaac Tesla. And this year, when did you first bring up the name Jake Slaughter? What was that?
I want to say October in college football questions or something like that.
He brought up the name Jake Slaughter in October. If Jake Slaughter, the center from Florida, ends up being the pick, you will have outdone yourself, my friend.
Dude, I already outdone myself. This is now I'm just heat checking, man. I'm heat checking.
He's just taking half-court heaves at this point.
They don't count towards your three-point percentage anymore. The NBA changed that rule.
Yeah. Hey, I'll give you guys a name to watch. I'm going to try and call my shot here. I don't think this is a day one pick, but I think it's a day two pick that fits what the Lions need at defensive end. Obviously, that's another huge question this offseason. I think our Mason Thomas from Oklahoma, Karsch, you probably saw him up close when Michigan played Oklahoma back in September, is someone that might not fit what the Lions have traditionally valued under Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, but fits what I think they need opposite Hutchinson, which is less of a power rusher and more of a speed rusher. I think our Mason Thomas has the explosive traits the Lions have valued and would give them more speed on a defense that by the end of last season was kind of lacking it. I think he makes some sense for them. I think Kyle Lewis, the Pittsburgh linebacker, who again might be a little bit undersized,
might be a
would
safety.
have the speed to thrive as like a box safety or even a coverage linebacker if they don't sign Anzalone, is another name that would boost a defense that needs more athletes, more speed.
I like the fact that Birchie's already calling shots on sleeper guys to look at.
I've got my list developing. I want you to.
What did Wayne Gretzky say, baby? What did Wayne Gretzky say?
I don't know what he say.
100% of the shots not taken don't go in.
Yeah, that's true.
Michael Scott said actually. Come on.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Gretzky just quoted Michael Scott.
Birchie will check in with you tomorrow and kind of recap what was said by Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. Appreciate your time, as always.
You guys got it. Talk to you soon.
There he is, the Birchie Kid joining us here on 97.1 The Ticket.